right about now, I cross my heart, I take the vow, I'll never turn, I'll never bend, I'm with you now, until the end.
All right, folks, we are back. It's the InfoWarrior with Jason Bermas, and we are now joined by Alan Watt. I was actually introduced to Mr. Watt's material back in December of 2007 while I was out in California. We were out in Naples, and I was with this gentleman who was helping us with an event, and he started playing the Cutting Through the Matrix podcast for me, and I said, wow, this guy's really smart. He's very insightful. He's well-spoken. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Watt.
It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Now, you know, I've always wondered, I've read your bio, but how does somebody like yourself get into this information and then not only get into it, but then start doing a radio show, speaking about it? It says here, you know, you're an accomplished author and lecturer and all that, but where does it start for you?
At birth, really.
Really?
I generally tell people I had a form of autism which allowed me to see the world as it really was.
So even in your musical career, you know, before you started doing this full time, you were pretty awake.
Absolutely, absolutely awake. And I also traveled a lot too, and I noticed that every country was passing the same laws across Europe at the same time, always. Mm-hmm. And I realized there already was a European Union back in the 70s. And I realized as well where it was all heading. And I talked to some politicians, because when in the music industry, often you will be approached and invited into homes of politicians and people who are big decision makers, and you get chatting to them, and not all of it registers at the time. Like sometimes it's 2 years down the road and it clicks as to what they actually said to you. But I was in a Norwegian's home in the 70s, and she went on to work at the United Nations. At that time she worked for the parliament there, and she talked about a united Europe and the fact that Scandinavian countries would be part of it, including Norway. So I heard all this stuff from the right people, generally at the dinner table, yeah.
Yeah, so you start hearing this stuff, you see that there's this kind of a globalist agenda, you see that they're trying to put the European Union into place, they eventually do that. When is it that you take the leap into doing this full-time? When do you say, because I see that you wrote a lot of books under pseudonyms, did you try to do that, you know, throughout your career, put out these ideas, or was there really just one incident, one spot where you said, you know what, I've got to devote myself to this, I've got to dedicate more time to this?
Yeah, I mean, previous works I'd done had to do mainly with history and ancient history, religions, techniques of controlling people in the past. And before 9/11, I realized what was coming up. I was reading the authors, the big players' books, the ones put out by Kissinger's and the Brzezinskis, and going all the way back through Huxley's, the different Huxleys, H.G. Wells, all the big boys, looking at the common threads that they all had and the associations to which they belonged to. And that led me right in, of course, to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, that really was set up to go around any idea of democracy, to bring in a global government system. And it goes back into the late 1800s. In fact, before it was called that name, it was called the Cecil Rhodes Foundation, and it had another name before that as well. So they were already working. They'd never intended, especially in Britain, that was to be the nucleus of a free trade world system. In Britain, they never intended to give the public real democracy. It would always be guided by an elite called the Crown under the Crown, a strange, odd democracy where you've got a monarchy on top of it. And in Britain, they call them the establishment. And everyone in Britain knows it exists, and it bypasses parliaments and so on. But I realized that they'd almost achieved their goal. And then, of course, I saw the events leading up to 9/11, 2001. I knew something was going to happen in 2001 because the big boys had pretty well predicted that was really the start of the next century. It was 2001, not the year 2000. And they said it was going to be a century of change. The big foundations had published many articles on what they wanted to accomplish in 100 years in the 21st century, and we're well on the road to it now, well on the road. So I had to come out and say it as it is, even though I knew, and this was a big problem I had, I knew the psychological warfare that my generation and previous generations had been born into and gone under and gone through, and I didn't know. I was very skeptical, in fact, if the public really could wake up in time to realize what was being done to them, because they truly have had incredible warfare put upon them by inoculations, and I don't trust them at all, inoculations. I've gone through some of the people who worked on methods of lobotomizing the general public, and they published it in their own books. They worked for big organizations, including the United Nations. We've had our food completely altered. Canadians were the guinea pigs for the GMO food without our consent, without our knowledge, for 10 years, while the governments, with their health organization, the socialized medicine, could study every single one of us and watch for effects. So we've been under warfare before we were born, right through to the present time, and you can see it in the public. The IQ officially has dropped. Now, you're born with an IQ. It's innate within you. And yet they've lowered the same test to a new normal, which is much lower, because they know what they've done to us. We're under a real war, and there's no way to emphasize it enough to the public, who mainly can't tell fact from fiction anymore. It's so intertwined. And they've also been trained, as Bertrand Russell advocated at the world meetings, they've trained the public to be hedonistic, narcissistic, self-centered, so to break the bonds of family especially. And in that way, you're a perpetual child. With the depression of economy, etc., coming in a big way, you're going into the next Bertrand Russell suggestion, which was the creation of apathy. Children, perpetual children, adult children, can easily be put into a state of apathy and controlled right along the agenda to the final outcome with ease on behalf of those in control. This has all been written about in books, dusty books, used in some universities still today, but ignored and unknown of by the general public.
Well, this does seem to be what's going on. I mean, you look at the lobotomized public, and what they're interested more than anything are their sports teams or their iPhone apps or, you know, the coolest gadget or the latest car, even in a time when many people are just losing their homes, you know, losing their jobs. I mean, IBM's about to lay off another 5,000 people, and the bankers are openly announcing that they're just going to print as much money as they want and do what they want with it. I mean, they're going to be buying up treasury bonds at the rate of $1.4 trillion and then maybe pump another trillion into that. The new packages that they just announced in the last couple of days call for, I think, 3.7 trillion more publicly. And then, you know, you have Obama getting up before this press conference. And the thing is, this, you know, the last 8 years, the U.S. was used to a leader that stammered, stuttered, was not well-spoken, didn't address people in really a proper manner, wouldn't look them in the eye, was very short and curt. It was very easy to attack this guy. Obama's a lot slicker. I mean, he got asked about the Chinese global currency because we know that China is now saying, you know what, we need a global currency. The IMF is saying they want to print a global super currency for quantitative easing. And he gets asked about that. He dodges the entire question. Finally, the reporter at the end of it asks again, well, what about this global currency? And Obama looks down and he says, I don't think there's a need for a global currency. Meanwhile, he's gearing up to go to the G20. And before the G20, he's meeting with the Queen in private. And as you alluded to before, you know, this royalty is really still in power. It amazes me that most people believe that Bill Gates is the richest man in the world. Meanwhile, you have royals that are still protected by all sorts of MI5, Secret Service. I mean, it boggles my mind that people can't get around the fact that that is the true wealth. I mean, these people have been wealthy for centuries. Centuries, and never mind the gifts have been given from other kings and queens over the centuries, that in itself, but they are untouchable as well. And they know they're untouchable. People in Britain understand that there's a different system above the Parliament are given, way high above it. And believe you me, every civil servant, every bureaucrat, every politician, even your policeman swears allegiance to the Crown, not to the people of Britain or its Parliament, but to the Crown, to royalty. And that's the same across the whole of the British Commonwealth countries, including Canada. Well, most people here just aren't aware of that. They don't understand that the Rothschilds have a sovereign nation in the middle of London. I mean, they don't understand these kind of things, and especially here where the royal family is kind of looked upon goofily. They don't think that they have any power whatsoever. People are just not awake at all. I mean, all right, I think that the top 3 guys that they said were rich were Bill Gates, and then it was Warren Buffett, and there's no doubt that Warren Buffett is a player out there, but he's definitely not, top round.
No.
And then I believe it was the King of Spain, who is royalty, probably does have some wealth there, but most of it hidden in foundations, such as the British royal family. I mean, that is their specialty, just like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. They like to hide their funds in these institutions they create. A great example is, these guys are major globalists. They had a push after the First World War for a League of Nations. When that failed, they created the Council on Foreign Relations, which is still going on today. And in fact, Tim Geithner was forced to talk about the Chinese global currency and said he was open to it, but ultimately we would keep the dollar as a world currency. But I think that tune is really going to change once this G20 happens and Obama visits it. I think he's scheduled to go there on April 2nd.